In the cold expanse of space, far from any charted territory, an alien vessel drifted silently. This was no ordinary ship. It belonged to the Vlaxer, a species known for their advanced technology and meticulous nature. The Vlaxer prided themselves on their precision, their technology so sophisticated that even a minor malfunction was a rare occurrence. They viewed themselves as the pinnacle of galactic civilization, their ships crafted with care and their systems nearly infallible. To them, lesser species were just that, lesser. The Vlaxer had always held a particular disdain for Deathworlders. These were beings from planets deemed too dangerous to support life, worlds where only the most resilient and adaptable could survive. The Vlaxer saw them as brutes, uncivilized and crude, relying on brute strength and primitive instincts rather than the elegance of technology. Stories of Deathworlders were told with a mixture of fear and contempt, a warning of the chaos that such beings could bring. But today, the Vlaxer ship was in a situation they had never anticipated. A sudden and catastrophic malfunction had struck their vessel. Without warning, the main energy core had destabilized, sending shockwaves throughout the ship. Systems failed one by one as the crew scrambled to regain control. The ship's navigation was offline, communication systems were dead, and life support was operating on minimal power. They were stranded, with no hope of repair in sight. Panic began to spread among the crew. Despite their technological prowess, the situation was beyond anything they had trained for. Every attempt to diagnose the problem only revealed more issues, as if the ship itself was falling apart under their feet. The Vlaxer were skilled, but they were not engineers in the traditional sense. Their expertise lay in maintaining already perfect systems, not in repairing something so severely damaged. As the hours passed, the situation grew increasingly dire. The ship floated aimlessly, a silent tomb in the void. The crew, usually so composed and confident, were now anxious and desperate. Every second that ticked by brought them closer to their doom. In their darkest moment, just when hope seemed lost, an alert flashed on one of the few operational consoles. A small vessel was approaching, an old, battered ship that looked nothing like the sleek, polished designs of the Vlaxer. The crew watched in disbelief as the ship docked, its appearance an affront to their refined sensibilities. When the airlock hissed open, what emerged was even more shocking. A lone figure stepped aboard, tall and broad, with an aura of confidence that seemed out of place in this bleak scenario. The Vlaxer recognized the markings on the figure's uniform, the insignia of a Deathworlder. The crew exchanged uneasy glances. They had heard the tales, the warnings, and now one of these dreaded beings was standing in their midst. The Deathworlder's presence was imposing, their movements deliberate and purposeful. The crew, despite their fear, could not help but be curious. The stories had always portrayed Deathworlders as violent and reckless, but this one seemed calm, focused. The engineer surveyed the scene with a practiced eye, taking in the damage with a quick assessment that left the Vlaxer in stunned silence. There was an air of disbelief among the crew. How could this Deathworlder possibly understand the complexities of their technology? Yet, as the engineer moved forward, there was a strange sense of relief, almost as if this outsider brought with them a promise of salvation. The crew didn't know whether to feel hope or terror, and so they stood back, watching, waiting to see what would happen next. In those first moments, as the Deathworlder began their work, the Vlaxer crew couldn't shake the feeling that their fate was now in the hands of a creature they had long considered beneath them. The fear and shock in their eyes reflected a deep-seated unease, a realization that everything they thought they knew about the universe was about to be challenged. The Deathworlder engineer moved with a quiet confidence that spoke volumes about their experience. There was no hesitation, no moment of doubt, as they began to assess the damage. To the Vlaxer crew, this was a moment of profound unease. Their entire society was built on the idea that technology could solve any problem, but they were witnessing something entirely different. This engineer didn't rely on the advanced systems the Vlaxer were so proud of. Instead, they approached the situation with a hands-on, almost instinctual understanding of machinery, something the Vlaxer had long dismissed as primitive. The crew watched, still skeptical, as the engineer opened a panel to examine the ship's failing energy core. This was no simple malfunction. The core had been destabilized by a series of cascading failures, each one compounding the next. The Vlaxer had tried and failed to contain the damage. Their automated systems were designed to handle such crises, but they had been overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the problem. What the Vlaxer didn't understand was that this was exactly the kind of challenge the Deathworlder was built for. The engineer's background was one of survival against all odds. Raised on a planet where nature itself seemed intent on eradicating life, they had learned to adapt to the most extreme conditions. On their homeworld, a malfunctioning piece of equipment could mean the difference between life and death. It was this relentless environment that had forged the engineer into someone who could not only survive but thrive in situations where others would falter. Their hands bore the scars of countless repairs, each one a testament to their resilience and skill. As the engineer worked, it became clear that the tools they used were not the sleek, advanced instruments of the Vlaxer, but rather an assortment of rugged, well-worn devices. Each tool had a purpose, and the engineer wielded them with a precision that belied their crude appearance. The Vlaxer, who had always valued the elegance of their technology, found themselves fascinated by the engineer's methods. There was a raw efficiency to the way the Deathworlder tackled the problem, stripping away the complexities that had confounded the ship's own systems and getting to the heart of the issue. The first major challenge came when the engineer encountered a critical breach in the energy conduit that powered the ship. The Vlaxer had attempted to seal the breach using their automated repair drones, but the damage was too severe, and the drones had simply shut down, unable to cope with the overload. The engineer, however, approached the problem differently. Rather than relying on automated systems, they used their hands, tools, and knowledge of basic principles to bypass the damaged section entirely. It was a solution the Vlaxer would never have considered. To them, the idea of manually rerouting power through a series of improvised connections seemed reckless, but the engineer's methodical approach left no room for doubt. The engineer worked quickly, their movements precise and deliberate, as if they had faced this exact situation countless times before. The alien crew watched in a mixture of awe and disbelief as the energy core slowly stabilized, the ship's systems beginning to come back online, one by one. The contrast between the Vlaxer's reliance on technology and the engineer's hands-on approach couldn't have been more stark. The Vlaxer had always believed that their technology would protect them, that their systems were infallible. But here was a being who had learned that technology was just a tool, one that needed to be understood and mastered, not worshipped. The Deathworlder didn't see the ship as a collection of systems and protocols. They saw it as a living entity, one that needed care and attention to keep running. As the repairs continued, the engineer encountered more challenges, each one more difficult than the last. A critical coolant leak threatened to destabilize the core once more, and a ruptured plasma conduit risked setting off a chain reaction that could destroy the entire ship. But with each new obstacle, the engineer adapted, using whatever resources were available, no matter how primitive they seemed. The Vlaxer, who had initially dismissed the engineer's methods as crude, began to see the brilliance in their simplicity. By the time the main repairs were complete, the Vlaxer crew had undergone a transformation of their own. They had started this ordeal with doubt and fear, convinced that their only hope lay in the sophisticated technology they had always trusted. But now, as they watched the engineer finish the final adjustments, they realized that true skill didn't come from machines. It came from understanding, from experience, and from the willingness to do whatever it took to survive. The Deathworlder had shown them that sometimes, the simplest solution was the most effective, and that true strength came from within, not from the tools one wielded. The repairs had been progressing steadily, with the ship slowly returning to a semblance of functionality. Systems that had been offline flickered back to life, and the energy core, once on the brink of meltdown, now hummed with a newfound stability. The alien crew, initially skeptical of the Deathworlder's abilities, began to feel a cautious optimism. Each success the engineer achieved chipped away at their doubts, replacing them with something unfamiliar: hope. As the engineer moved from one section of the ship to another, addressing one problem after another with the same unyielding focus, the crew could hardly believe what they were witnessing. Every action was deliberate, every decision rooted in experience, and an understanding of mechanics that went beyond anything the Vlaxer had encountered. The repairs that seemed impossible just hours before were now well underway, and the crew's faith in their survival began to grow. But just as the mood began to shift, the ship's alarms blared with a new intensity. A deep groaning sound reverberated through the vessel, followed by a sharp, jarring lurch. The ship's structure, weakened by the earlier failures, had reached a critical point. A fissure had opened in the main hull, compromising the integrity of the ship. The crew's momentary hope was dashed as panic once again took hold. The engineer didn't hesitate. With a swift motion, they redirected their efforts, moving to address this new, far more dangerous issue. The crew watched in silent terror, knowing that if the hull breach wasn't contained, it would mean the end for all of them. The fissure wasn't just a minor crack, it was a growing chasm, threatening to tear the ship apart. The Deathworlder assessed the situation, their mind racing through possibilities. The automated repair systems were offline, and there wasn't enough time to bring them back up. The ship's internal structure was too fragile to withstand the standard protocols for sealing a breach of this magnitude. Traditional methods wouldn't work here. Something drastic was needed, something that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. With a determined resolve, the engineer began to improvise. They stripped down the ship's non-essential systems, repurposing components to create a makeshift seal for the fissure. Every decision was made with precision, each action taken with an understanding of the delicate balance required to keep the ship intact. The alien crew, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, could do nothing but watch. Their advanced technology had failed them, and all that stood between them and oblivion was this single Deathworlder. The ship continued to groan and shudder as the fissure widened. The engineer worked with a speed and accuracy that defied the dire circumstances. Every second counted, and the pressure was immense. The crew, who had once viewed the Deathworlder with suspicion and disdain, now looked on with something approaching reverence. They realized that what they were witnessing wasn't just the work of a skilled technician, but the raw embodiment of survival instinct. As the engineer neared completion of the emergency seal, another complication arose. The ship's structural integrity was deteriorating faster than anticipated, and a critical support beam was on the verge of collapse. If it gave way, the entire section of the ship would be lost, and with it, any hope of survival. It was a life-or-death moment, the kind that the engineer had faced many times before but never under such extreme conditions. With no time to spare, the engineer made the decision to reinforce the beam manually. Using materials scavenged from the ship's interior, they began to shore up the failing structure. The work was grueling, the conditions almost unbearable, but the engineer pressed on. Every movement was a battle against time, every breath a fight to keep the ship from disintegrating. The alien crew could barely contain their fear. They had never seen such determination, such sheer willpower in the face of certain death. The engineers' actions defied logic, transcending what they believed was possible. The Vlaxer, so reliant on their technology, had never truly understood what it meant to fight for survival with nothing but your own hands and wits. Finally, with a final push of effort, the engineer completed the emergency repairs. The ship's structure stabilized, the fissure sealed, and the immediate danger passed. The crew let out a collective breath they didn't know they were holding. The ship had been saved, not by the advanced technology they had always trusted, but by the relentless resolve of a Deathworlder who refused to let them perish. The realization washed over them like a wave. This engineer had done the impossible. They had faced challenges that should have doomed the ship and had overcome them with nothing more than their skill, determination, and a refusal to give in. The Vlaxer crew, who had once looked down on this Deathworlder, now found themselves in awe, their perceptions forever changed. In this moment of triumph, they understood that true strength didn't come from machines or technology, but from the indomitable spirit that refused to be broken, no matter the odds. The ship had been stabilized, but the real test was yet to come. The critical systems were still offline, and the energy core, though no longer on the verge of exploding, was far from fully operational. The Deathworlder engineer knew that the most dangerous part of the repair was still ahead. This wasn't just about fixing what was broken, it was about ensuring that the ship could sustain itself long enough to reach safety. The alien crew, once skeptical and fearful, now looked to the engineer with complete trust. They understood that this was no ordinary challenge, and their lives depended entirely on the engineer's ability to succeed. The final hurdle was the ship's propulsion system. It had been severely damaged during the initial malfunction, and without it, the ship was doomed to drift aimlessly in space. The system required a full reboot, but doing so was no simple task. The process involved rerouting power from the compromised energy core, manually restarting the propulsion system, and ensuring that the ship's navigation controls were responsive. It was a delicate procedure, fraught with risk. One wrong move, and the ship could be torn apart by the very power it relied on to move. The engineer prepared for the task ahead, knowing that this was the moment that would determine the fate of the entire crew. The complexity of the repair required extreme precision, and to make matters worse, it involved an external spacewalk, a maneuver that would expose the engineer to the deadly vacuum of space. The crew, who had been watching in awe and fear, now found themselves willing to do whatever they could to help. They had seen the engineer perform miracles, and though they were not trained for this kind of work, their respect and admiration compelled them to offer their support in any way possible. As the engineers suited up for the spacewalk, the crew rallied around them. Some managed the remaining systems inside the ship, following the engineer's instructions with newfound determination. Others offered moral support, their voices steadying the engineer as they prepared to face the final challenge. The air was thick with tension, but there was also a sense of unity that had not existed before. The crew, once divided by their fear of the Deathworlder, were now united in their hope for survival. The spacewalk was a perilous endeavor. The engineer had to navigate the ship's exterior, avoiding debris and using every ounce of skill to remain tethered to the vessel. The propulsion system's primary circuits were located in a part of the ship that had taken the brunt of the initial damage, making access difficult and the work even more dangerous. But there was no hesitation in the engineers' movements. They had faced worse before, and they knew that the only way out was through. The critical moment came when the engineer reached the main junction of the propulsion system. The circuits were fried, the connectors barely holding together. Replacing them wasn't an option. There wasn't enough time or resources. Instead, the engineer had to jury-rig the system using whatever was at hand. It was a makeshift solution, one that would have been unthinkable to the Vlaxer, but the engineer knew it was the only chance they had. With steady hands and a mind honed by countless similar challenges, the engineer began the delicate process of rerouting power and re-establishing connections. The crew watched from inside the ship, their breath held as they followed the engineer's progress. They could see the strain in every movement, the pressure of knowing that failure wasn't an option. The ship shuddered and groaned under the strain, the tension reaching its peak as the engineer worked against the clock. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the engineer completed the last connection. With a deep breath, they signaled to the crew to initiate the reboot. Inside the ship, the crew followed the instructions, their hands trembling as they engaged the sequence. There was a moment of silence, a pause in which the entire fate of the ship hung in the balance. Then, with a sudden, almost violent jolt, the propulsion system roared to life. The ship lurched forward as power surged through its circuits. The crew erupted in cheers, their fear and anxiety replaced with overwhelming relief. The ship was moving, the systems were online, and for the first time since the disaster had begun, they were no longer stranded. The engineer, exhausted but triumphant, made their way back inside. The crew, who had once viewed this Deathworlder with suspicion, now greeted them as a savior. The engineer had done the impossible, not once, but multiple times, and in doing so, had earned the respect and admiration of everyone on board. The ship, once on the brink of destruction, was now back in working order. The immediate danger had been averted, and with the propulsion system restored, they could begin the journey back to safety. The final push had been a success, not just in terms of the repairs, but in the transformation it had brought about in the crew. They had seen what true skill and determination looked like, and it had changed them. The Deathworlder had not only saved their lives but had also shattered the prejudices that had once clouded their judgment. In that moment of triumph, The engineer had shown them that survival was not just about technology, but about the spirit and resolve that could overcome even the most impossible odds. In the quiet that followed the successful repairs, the alien crew found themselves in a state of profound reflection. The ship was now on a steady course back to safety, systems stable and propulsion secure, but the crew's thoughts were far from their immediate surroundings. They had just witnessed something extraordinary, something that defied everything they had believed about the galaxy and its inhabitants. The Deathworlder engineer had not only saved their lives but had also shattered the preconceptions that had been ingrained in them from birth. As they gathered in the control room, the atmosphere was heavy with a mix of awe and introspection. The crew members exchanged glances, each of them grappling with the implications of what they had experienced. They had been raised to view Deathworlders as primitive, as beings who survived through brute force rather than intelligence or skill. Yet here they were, alive because of the very qualities they had once dismissed. The engineer had shown them a different kind of strength, one that came from resilience, adaptability, and an unyielding will to overcome any obstacle. One of the senior officers finally broke the silence, voicing the thoughts that had been circling in everyone's minds. They spoke of how the engineer's approach had been unlike anything they had seen before, how it had gone beyond mere technical skill and entered the realm of pure ingenuity. The crew nodded in agreement, each of them adding their own observations. They spoke of the moments when all hope seemed lost, only to be revived by the engineer's relentless determination. What they had witnessed was more than just a series of repairs. It was a demonstration of what it meant to face the impossible and refuse to give in. The engineer, who had remained quietly in the background during the discussion, finally stepped forward. There was no need for grand gestures or dramatic statements. The crew was already hanging on every word. The engineer's voice was calm, steady, and filled with the quiet wisdom that came from years of hard-earned experience. They didn't speak of their own achievements, nor did they seek praise. Instead, they offered a simple truth, one that resonated deeply with the crew. The engineer spoke of how, in their world, survival wasn't a given but something that had to be fought for every day. They explained that technology was a tool, not a crutch, and that true strength came from understanding both its limits and its potential. It wasn't about relying on machines to solve problems, but about using every resource available, including one's own mind and hands. The crew listened intently, absorbing the lesson that was being imparted. They realized that what they had seen was not just the work of an engineer, but the embodiment of a philosophy that placed value on resilience and resourcefulness above all else. As the engineer finished speaking, there was a moment of silence, a collective pause as the crew processed the weight of the words. They understood now that the galaxy was far more complex and interconnected than they had ever imagined. The distinctions they had once made between species, the hierarchies they had believed in, seemed less significant in the light of what they had just experienced. The engineer's words had bridged a gap between them, one that they hadn't even realized existed. The crew's newfound respect for the engineer was palpable. It wasn't just about the fact that their lives had been saved, it was about the way their perspectives had been irrevocably altered. They no longer saw the Deathworlder as an outsider, as something to be feared or dismissed. Instead, they recognized the engineer as a kindred spirit, someone who understood the fundamental truths of existence in a way that transcended species and culture. The barriers between them had been broken down, replaced with a mutual understanding and respect. As the ship continued on its journey, the crew knew that they would never look at the galaxy the same way again. The engineer's actions and words had left an indelible mark on them, one that would influence how they approached their own lives and duties. They had learned that strength wasn't about superiority or technological prowess. It was about the courage to face adversity head-on, the wisdom to adapt, and the humility to learn from others, no matter where they came from. The story of what had happened aboard their ship would spread, and with it, the understanding that the galaxy was richer and more diverse than they had ever imagined. The crew would carry this experience with them, sharing the engineer's wisdom and ensuring that the lessons learned were not forgotten. The event would change the way they interacted with other species, fostering a sense of unity and shared purpose that had been missing before. As the engineer prepared to depart, there was no need for formal goodbyes. The connection that had been forged between them went beyond words. A simple nod of acknowledgement passed between the engineer and the crew, a silent agreement that they would meet again under different circumstances, as equals rather than strangers. The ship, now fully repaired and on course, was a testament to what could be achieved when differences were set aside in favor of cooperation and mutual respect. And so, as the engineer's small vessel detached and drifted away into the stars, the crew watched with a sense of gratitude and reverence. They knew that this encounter would not be the last, that the galaxy was vast and full of unknowns. But they also knew that they were better prepared for whatever came next, armed not just with technology, but with the knowledge that true strength came from within, from the willingness to face the impossible and emerge victorious. The galaxy had become a little smaller, and a little more connected, thanks to a Deathworlder who had shown them the true meaning of resilience.